You can popcorn, Kim.
Yeah, you can. We're on Deuteronomy chapter 20.
Okay. When you go to war and see before you vast numbers of horses and chariots, an army far greater than yours, don't be frightened. The Lord your God is with you, the same God who brought you safely out of Egypt. Before you begin the battle, a priest shall stand before the Israeli army and say, "Listen to me, all you men of Israel. Don't be afraid as you go out to fight today, for the Lord your God is going with you. He will fight for you against your enemies, and he will give you the victory." Then the officers of the army shall address the men in this manner: Has anyone just built a new house, but not yet dedicated it? If so, go home, for you might be killed in the battle, and someone else would dedicate it. Has anyone just planted a vineyard, but not yet eaten any of its fruit? If so, go home. You might die in battle, and someone else would eat it. Has anyone just become engaged? Well, go home and get married, for you might die in the battle, and someone else would marry your fiance. And now, is anyone afraid? If you are, go home. You frighten the rest of us. When the officers have finished saying this to their men, they will announce the names of the battalion leaders. Popcorn. Janet.
Had to get them muted. March up to attack the city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If you refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city, then the Lord your God delivers it into your hand. But to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves. Gee, women and all. And you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. When you lay siege to the city for a long time, fighting against it to capture it, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to it, because you can eat their fruit. Do not cut them down. Are the trees people are the trees people that you should besiege them? However, you may cut down trees that you know are not fruit trees and use them to build siege wars until the city at war with you falls.
Interesting, because the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, they were to completely destroy them, and I don't know that they were ever completely destroyed. It'll be interesting to see what our commentaries say.
Well, I thought it was interesting in verse 9. Wait, no. In verse 10, it says, you approach a city, offer it a truce, and if they accept the truce, then everybody's your servant. But if they refuse the truce, then you have to kill all the men, but everybody else is, then they take everything else to themselves. But then they go on into verse 16 and say, the cities within the boundaries of the promised land, you destroy everything. So were these cities within the boundaries of the promised land like that much more corrupt than the outlying cities that they didn't need to be destroyed? Or like, what's the difference?
I would think that they would, okay, so like if you look at the Roman Empire's history, it's one of the cool things I learned when I was over there. Like they would go into an area. So they would come into Chambersburg and they would say, listen, you all know we're going to take you. If you don't want to be our slaves, that's fine. Just submit to us. You can continue life as normal, pay tribute to us. We are over you, but you can continue life as normal. And then if Chambersburg was like, no, we're not submitting to you, you're not going to be our king, then they would go to war. Well, if they went to war, they would kill the men. They would take maybe some of the men, the children, the women, they would make them work in brothels or be slaves or whatever. So it was a good war strategy because when the Roman Empire would go somewhere, people knew like, if we want to continue our life, then it's easier just to submit to them and we can go on living our life. Or if we lose the war, then they're going to kill our men and turn our women into prostitutes. So as they grew and became more powerful, like they didn't really have to go to war. The towns would submit to them.
But those outer lying cities are still in the land of milk and honey, the promised land. It's just, or you're saying this is along the way. This is along the way.
I think it's
before they
along
get
the
to-
way, but we'll see what the commentaries
Okay.
say, because where the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites were living were what God promised them, I think.
Okay.
So he didn't want any of that evil worship, idol worship and stuff involved in that. But let's see what the commentaries say.
Okay, a brief overview, 21 to 20. The humanitarian principles applicable in war under Mosaic law are in stark contrast to the brutality and cruelty of other nations. 21, do not be afraid. When Israelites went into battle, they were never to fear an enemy's horses or chariots, because the outcome of a battle would never be determined by mere military strength. The command not to be afraid was based on God's power and faithfulness, which had already been proved to Israel in their deliverance from Egypt. 22 to 4. The priest shall speak to the people. The role of the priest in battle was to encourage the soldiers by God's promise, presence, and power to be strong in faith. A lack of trust in God's ability to fight for them would affect the strength of their will so that they would become faint-hearted. Victory was only linked to their faith in God. 25 to 8. Let him go and return to his house. 4 exemptions from service in Israel's volunteer army were cited to illustrate the principle that anyone whose heart was not in the fight should not be there. Those who had other matters on their minds or were afraid were allowed to leave the army and return to their homes, since they would be useless in battle and might even influence others to lose courage. 20, 10 to 15, offer of peace. And here's your thing on the cities, Kim. Cities outside of Canaan were not under the judgment of total destruction. So Israel was to offer a peace treaty to them. If the treaty agreed to become a vassal to Israel, then the people would become tributary subjects. However, if the offer of peace was rejected, Israel was to besiege, take the city, kill the men, take possession of the rest of the people and animals as the spoils of war. Note here the principle that the proclamation of peace preceded judgment. And I'm not, it gives a reference to Matthew 10:11-15.
Matthew
Approved.
11,
Matthew 10:11-15.
Matthew 10, 11 to 15.
Yeah.
Says, and when you enter whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it and stay there until you depart. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it's not worthy, let your peace return to you. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake the dust off of your feet when you leave that house or town. Truly, I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. Did you say 22?
No, it's Matthew 10:11-15.
That's it. Okay.
Okay. 20:16-18, utterly destroyed. The Canaanite cities were to be totally destroyed. That is, nothing was to be spared in order to destroy their influence toward idolatry. 20:19-20, you shall not destroy its trees. When besieging a city, armies in the ancient world would cut down the trees to build ramps and weapons, as well as facilities for the long siege. However, Israel was not to use fruit trees in the siege of a city, so they could later enjoy the fruit of the land God had given to them. And that's it. Okay, so I'm coming back to this with Kim, with what she said. So they're going into the land of Canaan. So is Canaan, I know it says the land, but is Canaan like a nation? Is it a large city? You know, I'm just trying to figure this out. Because it said cities outside of the land of Canaan. Well, they're going into Canaan. So I don't know, Kim, I'm puzzled.
Well, I guess I'm curious, this promised land, like, I guess I've never really seen on a map or realized from a map that I have seen how great, how many, what would be the size of it, similar to the size of this whole area. And so then that maybe would give me perspective as to how large the cities were that were inside of it. Like, is it as big as the state of Pennsylvania, or is it as big as the United States, or like what?
Yeah.
There's probably a map out there. I'll look here. What
The promised land is how large of a stance.
Because I understood the land was right there. You know, you're going into the land, there it is.
Yeah, you cross over
So-
the river,
Yeah,
and then you're in it.
right. So I'm thinking, okay, so how are you getting to these other cities? Do you have to go through these cities to get to the land? I don't know.
And I thought it was desert.
Well, you would have peoples living. It is desert, but you still have peoples living there. Promised land, according to Wikipedia. It's just slightly bigger than what it is right now, according to Wikipedia. So it would cover more, like the boundaries are just a little bit larger into like the Jordan. Okay, so they're getting their information from Numbers 34, 1 through 12. Is one set of mapping, and Ezekiel 47, 13 through 20 is the second set of mapping.
I have 34, 1 through 12.
I don't know that it will probably just be like God said, this belongs to you. maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, it's describing the boundaries of Canaan. It doesn't, it says like the coast, the western coastline of the Mediterranean Sea to blah, 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 to blah, blah, blah. So we really don't know how large of an area, so we could compare it in our mind, something in the United States.
Okay, here, I got one that looks pretty good because a lot of it, the northern part is not what, so I'm gonna send it in our little group. The green is what they actually have today, and then you'll see the outline for what God promised them. Which there's a good bit more land to the north part, which they will get in the millennial reign.
I mean, the
You'll see like
Mediterranean.
Lebanon and Jordan. What is current Jordan and Lebanon? Do you guys get it?
Yeah.
Are you saying the green is Canaan?
The green is the land that they're in currently, but the land that they're promised is the purple line or whatever that is, blue line, is the outline of what they was promised to them. So then we would have to figure out like where these people were living. But I'm thinking that they
So there were these cities throughout Canaan. And
well,
then I don't want to belabor this, but I'm thinking, okay, so there's these cities throughout it.
well, it says when you
Okay.
draw near to a city to fight against it, you offer peace first and then you go in and take it. So I'm wondering, but then down here, he's like, these cities, you don't save anything that breathes. They go completely destructed. So I would think they would have to be going through these other ones on the way.
What it reminds me of is when I look at a map of like the coast of Florida and it's got all these little dots. So you're in the state, but then there's all these little beaches and towns along the way, and those are the cities within. So the promised land is like the state, and then all these other little places are cities, like the state of Pennsylvania, and we have Chambersburg and St. Thomas and Philadelphia, and some of them are more business, some of them are more rural. And so this is kind of, I'd say this is more comparable to a state within our country, and all these cities are these little
That makes sense.
smaller.
And so these are Israelites, new people, so to speak, to that area. And this is what they were to do as they went into the promised land with the cities. Because
So it's in, oh, sorry, Cindy.
no, that's all right. Because they were to take over the entire land or state, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about like Israel and Judah. Like if you think about them before too, like Israel, remember God dispersed them first to the 10 lost tribes, and then he went 200 years later and took Judah, which was below. So I'm thinking that these are on the outskirts, could still have been, yes, Kim, what you're saying, like could have still have been in that area, but like the Temple Mount and like Judah were like the holy of the holies. And these were in that area. I don't know, maybe Worsby will give us some insight.
But he wanted those cities destroyed because of their false
Worship.
religion.
Mhm.
Yeah. You ready?
Yeah.
War in the land. The Jews weren't entering Canaan as sightseers, but as soldiers prepared for battle and expecting God to give them victory. It's important to note that God gave the nation two different military approaches, one for the cities in the land of Canaan, verses 1-9 and 16-18, and the other for cities outside Canaan, verses 10-15. After Israel had conquered the land and was settled down in their inheritance, they might have to attack a distant city because there were always enemies to deal with, and they could always accept the challenge of claiming God's promise in enlarging the land. The Lord's assurance, verse 1. Moses didn't minimize either the size or the strength of the enemy, for he knew that the nations living in Canaan had horses, chariots, large armies, and fortified cities. The spies who had investigated the land 38 years before had seen all these obstacles and dangers, Numbers 13, but failed to see how small these matters were compared to the greatness of their God. Moses reminded the people that the Lord had successfully brought them from the land of Egypt to the plains of Moab and defeated every enemy that had attacked them. In fact, the territory Israel now inhabited belonged to the Jews and not to the enemy, because the Lord had given his people great victory over the nations east of the Jordan. Just as the Lord had defeated Pharaoh and his army in Egypt, so he would defeat the nations in Canaan. In the early days of the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt said in his inaugural address, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. There is fear that mobilizes a person, as when you hear the fire alarm go off, but there's also fear that paralyzes a person, and that's the fear that Moses was addressing. When we fear the Lord and trust him, we need not fear the enemy. Israel had nothing to fear, for the God who drowned the army of Egypt would defeat the armies of Canaan." The priest's encouragement, verses 2-4. This was not the high priest, but one of the other priests who was assigned to address the army. We shouldn't be surprised to hear a priest encouraging the army, because the wars in Canaan were holy wars, God's judgment against wicked nations that had rebelled against him and sinned against the flood of light. The Lord had given these nations ample time to repent and turn to him, but they refused to obey. Israel's miraculous deliverance from Egypt and the crossing of the Jordan River was proof enough that Almighty God was with them and that judgment was coming. Joshua 2. The Jews were God's people fighting God's battles, and it was fitting that they hear from God's servant, a priest. There's a note here. The priests marched with the Jewish army around Jericho and blew trumpets, and a Levite named Jehazel gave a message of encouragement to King Jehoshaphat before the king went out to battle. Benaiah, son of Jehodiah, the priest, and one of David's mighty men, was the leader of the king's bodyguards and succeeded Joab as captain of the army when Solomon became king. Priests could become soldiers. The Lord's fear not is what every believer needs to hear when confronting the enemies of the faith. It's the message the Lord gave to Abraham after helping him defeat the kings in Genesis, and to Jacob when he left home to go to Egypt. Moses gave that message to the Jews as they stood at the Red Sea in Exodus, and the prophet Isaiah repeated it several times to encourage the Jewish remnant. You find the phrase 7 times in the Gospel of Luke. Trying to find out what that phrase is in the several times you find the phrase 7 times in the Gospel of Luke, and then it has the references listed. When we walk by faith and keep our eyes on the Lord, he will give us peace we need. And that's in Philippians. You are heading for victory when you know the Lord is with you and fighting for you.
some of that didn't make sense to me.
Is the phrase fear not?
Yeah. Fear not.
Yeah.
Is that what it is?
Mhm.
Okay. Then we go to verses 5 to 9, the officer's encouragement. The priest encouraged the soldiers to face the enemy without fear, but the officers told them to go back home if they had any unfinished business. No officer wants to lead distracted soldiers whose minds and hearts are elsewhere, for a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. James 1:8. Paul may have had this scene in mind when he wrote 2 Timothy 2:4. No one engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. The officers announced 3 different occasions for granting temporary deferment, and the first was to allow a soldier to dedicate a new house to the Lord and start living. The word translated dedicate also means to initiate, that is, to start living in the house with his family, enjoying it. Family needed the man much more than the battlefield did, so he was deferred for a year. The second occasion was to harvest a new vineyard whose fruit the soldier hadn't yet tasted. According to Leviticus 19:23-25, an owner of the orchard had to wait until the 5th year before he could eat the fruit of the trees.
Was there a reference
Yes.
there for that husband taking the first year? I think that was the law. Like they had a year together where they didn't have to work or anything.
It just has Deuteronomy 25. 20 verse 5 is all it has there.
Oh.
And I don't remember reading that when we read the
For
Mm-mm.
verse 5. Oh no, that's about the house. Yeah, well, Nehemiah 12:27, but I don't know. I have to look it up if that's what they're talking about.
'Cause I think like when they got married, the first year they stayed, like I don't even think the man had to work. But I don't know where I got that from.
when we were reading that, what was going through my mind was even nowadays, when the draft was instituted, you didn't have a choice. You had to go. Didn't matter whether you were afraid or not. And it stands to reason. I mean, you have people that enlist just because they want to enlist, and they know the risk when they enlist of what could happen if we're at war, yada, yada, yada. Somebody who doesn't even want in there for whatever reason, maybe it is just fear of the death, or they don't want to leave their family behind or whatever. This makes sense that they would say, okay, if you have this going on. Now, according to this, now it's saying that they only had like if you were newly married or whatever, you only had a year, and then it looked like you had to go.
Well, as you were reading that, and as we read the passage, I frankly, I was very surprised that they were given an out, that it was voluntary, because I know currently in Israel, because my brother-in-law is Jewish and he has grandchildren, you have to serve. There's no choice. 2 years after graduation, you have to do it. So I thought, I was really surprised by that all those allowances were given. But I understand, they're not going to be that useful. But my mother ran the selective service system during the Vietnam War and after. And she would 2 times a week, we didn't have a car, and she would walk quite a distance to meet the bus at 4:30 a.m. in the morning to get these guys on. You're right. There was no choice. A lot of people went to Canada, I don't know, Mexico. But I was very surprised reading this because I know that's not the case today. So I'm thinking, what changed?
Yeah.
Deuteronomy 25:7 says, when a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any other public duty.
Well, it all makes sense, what's being stated. But, and I think it's either South Korea or North Korea, it's the same requirement. You have to serve, male, female.
Well, when we would be over there, like the training of the soldiers, they would be taking them to all the memorial things and teaching them the history of their country so that they would have pride in what their country had accomplished and know what they would be fighting for. If we would do that over here, we would have a much different culture.
You know, I've thought about
Like
this.
that,
There,
Nick.
in today's culture, are you kidding me? Requiring
I
and
wish it was
making,
though. I think it would be very good for our young men to go to boot camp for the discipline, having to take instructions, and I think they're too coddled.
yeah, I think they can use the discipline because, you know, when you get out of high school, you don't know what you want to do. I mean, you know, let's be honest here. You're young and all you've known is going to school, and now there you are.
And being taken care of.
Right.
This brings me back to whenever my grandson in training. What was Josh in at, Kathy?
Marines.
Marines. And when we went down for his graduation, we were talking, and he said the one kid that was in his didn't want to be there, so he shot himself in the foot to get out.
Oh, gee.
Yeah,
Ow.
I thought, well, he was worthless to begin with, I guess.
That's pretty desperate.
That's a lifelong injury to get out of something.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
My
Kathy. we got-
thought
Go ahead.
when we were reading this information in verse 20 or chapter 20, I thought, who would be left?
What I was
thought they were
thinking
going
too.
That's true.
Okay, the second occasion was to harvest a new vineyard whose fruit the soldier hadn't yet tasted. According to Leviticus 19:23-25, an owner of the orchard had to wait until the 5th year before he could eat the fruit of the trees, but this law probably wasn't applied to vineyards.
Leviticus
5 years, 19:23-25.
Thank you.
5 years would be a rather long deferment. The third occasion was perhaps the most important, and this was to permit the engaged soldier to go home and get married. According to Deuteronomy 24:5, he was deferred a year. There's that one you were looking for.
We'd have just kept
There it is.
reading.
These three exceptions suggest to us that God is more interested in our enjoying the common blessings of life, homes, harvest, and honeymoons, than devoting ourselves only to the battles of life. He didn't want any of the Jewish men to use their military responsibilities as an excuse to neglect their families, their vineyards, and their fiancés. Certainly, military service was important, but the Lord was more concerned that the men have the right priorities in life. What good was accomplished for the Jewish people if the army defeated the enemy on the field, but things were falling apart back home? The priest asked the soldiers to look up and trust the Lord, and the officers asked them to look back and consider any unfinished business that would hinder them from doing their best. But the officers presented another challenge and asked the soldiers to look within, see if they were too afraid to go into battle. Gideon lost 22,000 men when he issued this challenge in Judges. Fear and faith can't coexist successfully in the same heart. References to Matthew and Luke. Furthermore, fear is contagious and could discourage the other soldiers. It was fear and unbelief that caused Israel's great failure at Kadesh. Once the ranks had been thinned out, the officers would appoint captains, so each man had to be ready to serve. At this time, Israel didn't have what we would call a standing army with an organized system of permanent officers. The major officers knew their best men and assigned leadership responsibilities for each campaign. When Saul became king, he formed the nucleus of a standing army, and his successor, David, developed the organization even more. In fighting God's battles, faith and courage are important, but so are authority and order.
Is that it?
No, well, that's not it. It starts then in verse 10, but I didn't know if you want to keep going or.
Do we want to break there? It's 10:31. All right. we'll break there. Kathy, will you mark that?
Yeah,
So we know where to pick up tomorrow. So we'll finish out Worsby and then we'll do Tony tomorrow. This concludes the reading of God's word for today. See you tomorrow.